Okay, welcome everyone to our seminar today on Tibetan voices. And I'm pleased to welcome back one of our MA alumna, Eleanor Byrne-Rosengren, who is Executive Director of Tibet Watch and Free Tibet. She's an alumna of our MA in Human Rights. Also joining her is Wangden Kyab, who's a Research Manager at Tibet Watch. And also we're pleased to welcome writer, poet, and activist Tenzin Tsundue. So I'm going to hand over to Eleanor, who's going to walk us through the session, and we'll have a chance for questions at the end. Okay?
Thank you. Hi everyone. So we're going to start this session today with a little bit of Tibetan poetry, and I'll let you absorb the poems, and then I'll tell you why these particular verses are so important and so precious. This first one, I'm just going to read an extract because it's quite long. It's called In Memory of Wild Yaks. Before the red wind raged, that bend on the mountain was where the wild yak roamed. Today, my grandfather stares at the bend, remembering that animal called the wild yak. When the stones and grasslands upon which wild yaks left their hoof prints are being levelled off to bring an end to the outer and inner life force, then the wild yaks of old days are left silent beneath the ground upon which you walk today. Before the red wind raged, that bend on the mountain was where the wild yak roamed. Today, my grandfather stares at the bend, remembering that animal called the wild yak. What we see today at the bend of the hill are the highway and the cement electricity poles. Wild yaks who lifted the sun and the moon in the space between their horns, have they disappeared behind the western hills? Wild yaks have never been domesticated, nor can they be servant-like domestic animals. Wild yaks have no rings through their noses and hence have no sense of servitude. Wild yaks have very strong nature. Wild yaks do not like oppression and occupation. Wild yaks dance on the palms of red hands. Wild yaks lick the red hands to death with their tongues. Wild yaks do not make secret deals. Wild yaks march into the barrels of hunters' guns facing them. Wild yaks jump down the cliffs rather than being humiliated. Wild yaks have never died with their necks tethered with ropes, like domestic animals. You were separated from the high plateau. You were separated from the natural world. You are separated from dewdrops on the grasses, but you are unable to separate from the depth of my spirit. So this particular poem has travelled literally from the mountains where the wild yaks roam, across those mountains into India, where it has been translated by a Tibetan poet called Byrne-Rosengren, who lives in Dharamshala, which is where my friends and colleagues also live. It's quite rare that we get poems to translate. It's quite rare that we get any communication at all coming across the mountains from Tibet, or through any other channel from Tibet. China very much fears what Tibetans might say to outsiders, or vice versa. And especially when there is something to say, like in the wake of a protest or some other incident that it might be useful and important for us to know about, quite often communication lines are cut, like literally. The phone lines are cut, the internet is cut, because all communication is state controlled. So the Chinese authorities are able to just make that happen very quickly when they need to. So it's very difficult. Tibet Watch reported earlier this year on a Tibetan man who was arrested and interrogated because he had a telephone conversation with his own brother. But his brother happened to live in Australia. So he was accused of being involved in separatist activities and having communication with outside influences who wanted to help split the country. So anyone communicating with friends or family faces that kind of accusation and treatment. So you're starting to build a picture now of how difficult it is for these poems to reach us, and why it's so brave that people are willing to risk arrest to get their words to us outside. And also these poems give us a very rare insight into the thoughts and feelings of Tibetans living under occupation. And because communication is so difficult, when we do hear from Tibetans, it's very often very factual. This happened at this time, this person was arrested, this many people were beaten or shot. And we don't get to hear how people feel about these incidents, because they're trying to just get those very few words out while the phone lines are open or before somebody can trace their call. So to get page after page of the inner thoughts of Tibetans living inside Tibet is really precious. I'm going to read one more, and then we'll hear one in Tibetan. This one, the first one came from a nomadic area, as you might guess. This one comes from more of a city. It's called "Today I Wish to Offer 3 Prostrations Towards Lhasa." My dinner last night was terror and anxiety. When the spies strolled the cafes and streets of Naba, I dreamt of Lhasa, dreaming of red blood dripping, green footprints appearing underneath the bloodied hands. Waking up in the morning, I remembered myself. I stroked my head with my right hand. No, my long hair is not cut. I checked my feet with my left hand. They are not shackled. This morning, affection was the companion on Avenue 10. Affection, the origin of our fathers and mothers. The Sempopa, or the Kingdom of Tibet, that too is affection. In short, that is who I am. Food at the D restaurant tasted burned, exactly like the smouldering of my flesh and bones. The smile of the waiter resembled an approaching red cliff from which some guests are tumbling down. Some at the back are being tossed down. Many chat in Tibetan on QQ. I don't know each of them by name, but I understand the language they write in. This proves that we are of the same blood. Can't people of the same blood be in touch with each other? It's not long since I am holding this apple. I am a prisoner. It's not long since I've been out of that door. My friends do not have much knowledge about this, but I think the spies have very good information on it. I write poetry in the space meant for messages, because I have so many things to tell. Because I have joys, sorrows, and resentments. I have feelings that I cannot accommodate inside me. You have asked me about many issues. I have responded to them honestly. However, I alone am the owner of these thoughts. He who is imbued with power and authority might tell others not to think too much. Yet someone who holds freedom as faith will never say yes. I'm sorry, do you have any other questions? Did I commit any crime? Do I get punished for my answers? If not, let me go. I'm feeling a little cold today. I'm very terrified. I want to get out and offer 3 prostrations towards Lhasa. And now I don't know which page it's on because my Tibetan is still rubbish, so I'll let you find the right one. We're going to hear a little of the first poem that I read to you in its native Tibetan.
Tibetan version which Eleanor already written in English translation one, in memory of patriarchs. So I read in Tibetan. Don't listen to. A woman Martin Munda, Paki Naka Kana, don't show such way. They don't duck army, Jenny, don't say the taxi transit. Donkey, a multi-shin yongi, Ayado, one go get up. They don't say she, Sajin Mudonim Shini, Sheso Nansu Jetson now. Do Mangu Mampi Monji, John Sevi Radapte, Eran, Chuchi Kon, Assassin de O, Cusme, Desona. A woman Martin Mola, Paki Naka Gana, John Shopsa Shiril, Eran, Daka Ami, Naka Ganda Cheni, John Sevi Ratashi Eran, Naka Gani, Tontapana, was on them down, and them Kiavon de Soli. Near Dara, the Kurnian don't know resistant. Donna, sit on Gososi Manonga. Donna, sit on Tanyu Tabi Gososi Mato. Donna, another maybe Donna Tanyu Kun the Shimin. Donna, Ranshi Hachan Tapui. Donna, a Yaman Tan Tenzin Donna, Lama Chilistan to Joe Cham Kansigre. Donna, Lama Shelters in a soon Kansig. Donna, competition consumer, Donna, a mombi ocher, or don't stand in consider. Donna, around she choke, so the Jayan Lachi be dark you such. Donna, a ghost of the key down near the sheet of Manu. Donna, Nankala Tandel Tambo you be. Donna, Aramka Punda, Menate, Dasha, and Tankan. Donna, Ranka Pundi, a Matala, Bombushing Considered. Donna, Sonsa, Dasa, Canton, Aramtan Kira Taxi. Donna, Amarjin Kia Nili. Donna, Loxo Shasami. Donna, Dapome. Donna, Jeremy.
Thank you. This is the book in question, and if you have any interest in reading further Tibetan poetry, then we do have this available in the Free Tibet shop. And Bushan will be delighted if we sell more copies for him. We're now going to run through a couple of very basic facts about Tibet, for those of you in the audience who might not know everything that's happened there. This is the Tibetan flag. I think it's a beautiful flag, far more creative than your average 3 stripes. And this is banned in Tibet because it's a symbol of Tibetan nationhood and identity, and China doesn't like that, it finds it threatening. So there are plenty of Tibetans living inside Tibet who have never set eyes on this flag and never will unless they make the journey into exile. This is where you'll find Tibet on the map. We've highlighted the whole region of Tibet here. Tibet was invaded in 1950 and China divided this territory up, and what is now called the Tibet Autonomous Region is only about half of the full territory of Tibet. It should be, I think, the 10th largest country in the world. These are a couple of images from the invasion, which occurred in 1950. And the next the next key point in Tibet's history was the National Uprising, which occurred in 1959. The Tibetan people had been through 9 years of occupation by this stage, and the trigger for the uprising was they feared that the military was actually about to assassinate the Dalai Lama, and that was the final straw for many people. Unfortunately, the uprising was quashed quite brutally, and the Dalai Lama was persuaded to make the journey into exile for his own safety. and around 100,000 Tibetans went with him, not all of them on that particular night, but around that time. And in the years since the uprising, as a result of the repression, the Cultural Revolution, imprisonment, torture, other things that have occurred, over 1 million Tibetans have died as a result of China's occupation. The next big flashpoint were the protests which occurred in Lhasa in the late 80s. These were triggered at the end of September 1987 and carried through until March 1989, at which point martial law was imposed. This image here was one of the most iconic images from that period of protest in the late 80s. We then had a period of relative quiet again until it all erupted in 2008. And one of the reasons we're doing this tour, this particular year, is to mark the 10th anniversary of this particular uprising. It's been 10 years, and this one was a little different. The uprising of '59 was crushed, and the uprising in the late 80s was crushed. We had martial law, we had the troops came in, and each of those was followed by a period of quiet. They were also relatively confined. Most of the protest occurred in Lhasa, which is the capital city of Tibet. In 2008, the protests spread right across the plateau. We had monks and nuns involved, lay people, students, old and young, areas in central Tibet and right out across to the border of China. In total, we had 344 incidences that we were able to confirm. It's likely there were many more. These are the ones that we were able to get details of and verify. Similarly, the 227 deaths that we were able to record and the 6,810 arrests. These are the numbers we could confirm. It's likely in reality that they are much higher. But Tibet Watch has a policy of verifying and checking everything, and we will never put data out unless we are confident that we've confirmed it. After the 2008, the main incidences of protest were crushed brutally and violently, as they always have been. Things changed and we saw new forms of protest emerging. One of these, which you may have heard of, is self-immolation, and to date over 150 Tibetans have given their lives for the freedom struggle. We've also seen solo protests, which generally consist of somebody running down a street holding a picture of the Dalai Lama or a slogan, sometimes with prayer flags. These people are usually arrested very quickly, and Tibetans are actually quite good at getting their phones out and videoing and sending it to someone as fast as they can. So we do manage to get details of these. We've seen lots of environmental protests, and we've seen cultural expression as a form of resistance and protest. This is a family having a picnic to celebrate the Dalai Lama's birthday. This is something which is illegal in Tibet today. It's something that people have been shot for doing. In my first year with Free Tibet and Tibet Watch, I got a call in the summer saying a group of Tibetans had gathered on a mountainside to say prayers for the Dalai Lama on his birthday, and the troops had surrounded them and a monk had been shot in the head. That's how China responds to a birthday party. So it's incredibly brave that Tibetans will express their culture and express their identity in ways that you or I would take for granted, but they do it knowing that they face arrest, potential torture, certainly violence. and it speaks to their creativity as well as their determination and resilience. And I think it's incredibly inspiring what's been going on there for the last 10 years, and that's why we're here to share it with you today. But I'm now going to bring in Wangden, and he's going to speak to you in a little more detail about 2008 and give his personal perspective on some aspects of it. So first of all, would you please tell people a little bit about yourself?
Hello everyone. My name is Wangden, and I was born in Tibet to a family whose 3 generations actively and effectively engaged in fighting against the Chinese occupation, and then they subsequently jailed, tortured, and even died. And I'm the 4th generation, and then I later escaped and currently working as a research manager based in Dharamsala in North India.
So let's turn now to 2008. Can you tell people a little bit, basically tell them what happened, and I'll run through a few slides.
So 2008 Uprising has happened, which was a great uprising that happened across the Tibetan plateau, and that really kind of signs that happened since 2007, and also in the beginning of 2008 also kind of protests happened from certain areas, but the actual protests broke up on 10th March 2008, that they marked the National Uprising Day. Then around 100 monks from Depot Monastery, it's just located at outskirts of the Lhasa city, which is the capital of Tibet. And monks gathered there, and then they made prayers, and then they started the protest and marched till to the main temple, Zulakhan, which is at the center. But in between, the Chinese armed forces blocked them and then brutally crushed down the protesters. And at the same time, in Lhasa and also in some areas in other part of the Tibet, also they started to protest against the Chinese rule. And subsequently, the Chinese sent more forces to the areas where the protest was happening, and then crushed down the protesters using different tactics. In certain protests, they used the tear gas, and in certain cases, they beat the protests like anything. And in many cases, even they shoot into the unarmed protesters, and tens and hundreds Tibetans killed and thousands injured. And after this brutal crackdown, and particularly the shooting incident happened in several areas inside Tibet, then the real protest happened. It really sparked the entire protest across the Tibetan plateau, and in following 2 weeks, around 340 protests happened in different areas across the Tibetan plateau. That's only we be able to come from. And then since the 10th March, it's almost like locked down to outside. And then the foreigners completely cut out of Tibet. And then Tibetans also sought from the other areas, whether it's communication or phone, whatever the communication channels or they were completely cut off. So, but still we could only confirm like that, so you can imagine how many more incidences and then killings and arrests happened. And then after 1 and 2 months of the protest still going on, but then they started to raid the Tibetan areas from the door to door and village to village, and then started arrests and then put in jails, and the crackdown continued. But still the protest continued almost entire year.
And what would you say were the main factors that sparked the protest?
There are obviously number of factors and elements that burst this protest. But just in brief, I make in 2 different categories. One was the long-term factors. That obviously main reason was the occupation. And since the Chinese occupied Tibet, they implemented kind of repressive policies and rules inside Tibet. And it's really make everything difficult in every walks of life in Tibet. And since last 50, 60 years, the Tibetans are not happy at all under the Chinese rule. That's the long factor. And then when we think about the immediate factors, again, there are a number of immediate factors, but I just try to highlight few of main immediate factors. One was the US Congressional Gold Medal, which was awarded to His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2007. And when the Tibetans inside Tibet, they heard the news of giving the award to His Holiness, then Tibetans, they started to celebrate from village, from grassland, and from monastic institutions. And obviously, the Chinese government, even the photos of Dalai Lama burnt in Tibet. And when these celebrations happening around the village and the grassland, then the Chinese armed forces, they crushed the crowd and imprisoned and put in camps to give patriotic re-education, and this kind of things continuously happened. And then the second one was the 2008 Olympic Games in China. So in that time, the entire world was watching into China, what's going on there. And then Tibetans also knew that the entire attention from the globe into China. And then they really strongly feel like to express what's going on there and to show the grievances that the Tibetans are suffering under the Chinese rule. And at the same time, also Chinese government, they really wanted to portray that everything is really fine out there. And for that, the Chinese completely locked down the Tibetan area to outside and even to mainland China. And then they restricted on the movement of Tibetans within Tibet. And then the different tactics and rules and regulations imposed for Tibetans inside Tibet. And that really kind of make anger that Tibetans who are living inside Tibet. And there are many more other immediate factors, but I think, and also another immediate factor was the march to Tibet. That was the Tibetans who are living inside Tibet, led by 5 major NGOs in India. They started this march to Tibet from Dharamsala, North India, to Tibet. Their final destination should be like Potala in Lhasa. But after 6 months of their march to Tibet, they were stopped by Indian government at the very border. And when Tibetans inside Tibet, they heard this kind of really inspiring and encouragement and influenced them to walk down to the street and to voice their voices.
And where were you in 2008?
I was in South India, obviously in India, and doing my studies in there.
And did you get involved when you heard about the protests that were happening?
Obviously, being a Tibetan and Tibetan students, I have to. And once we heard the news about the protests and subsequent crackdown, we were really concerned in a way. And on the other hand, we felt like no time come for us to stand up and fight against the occupation and free ourselves from the occupation. And then we communicate with the other college and university students across the India. And finally we started the All India Tibetan College Students Mass Movement. And I was one of the organizers. And then around 500 Tibetan then ongoing students gathered in Delhi, and we started the protest for a week long in Delhi.
And how did you feel about what was happening inside Tibet? When you heard that Tibetans inside Tibet were protesting and you heard about the crackdown and China's response, how did you feel?
Obviously, I mentioned from the beginning itself, like the 3 generations of my forefathers, they were involved and engaged in fighting in resistance against the occupation. And I have that kind of connections with my forefathers. And that's the main reason I came to India also. And when I heard the news of protests that happened in Tibet and then crackdown, then I feel like this is really time. And that time I was really ready even to sacrifice my own life. And not only me, many Tibetan students, they are ready to sacrifice their own life for the nation, for the people. And that's the reason why the around 500 Tibetans who gathered there voluntarily, and even many of them, they just left their classes or college, university like that. Because it's not just like simple issue, but it's a survival of a nation and of our people. So they come out and stand there and fight for the people, and with sympathy with the Tibetans who killed the crackdowns.
Okay, so let's move forward a little bit now. What can you tell us about life inside Tibet today, after the uprising?
The Chinese military started coming to Tibet since 1949, and from 49 till 59, they started colonize from certain areas of eastern Tibet and from all the areas till the 1959, and then completely annexed. And since then, what I told you earlier, the repressive rules and policies imposed everywhere, and under that, Tibetans suffered in aspects of religious freedom and human rights and movement and language and even the life to live in their own land are really kind of difficult subjects. And particularly after 2008, the Chinese, they sent more and more armed forces to the Tibetan areas, even in grassland and to the village and monastic institutions, and then they patrolled kind of security stations and police checkpoints everywhere. And then officially it's not kind of martial law like which imposed in 1989, but unofficially it's more than martial law. And the Chinese imposed kind of laws that the Tibetans cannot gather in groups more than 2 after 2008 happened. So in a nutshell, the Tibetans inside Tibet today, for them there's no space to breathe freely. This is the life of Tibetans inside Tibet today.
And how would you describe the legacy of 2008? How has it changed the way that Tibetans protest and resist the occupation?
I just try to highlight a few visible legacies of 2008 uprising, but they are tangible and intangible legacies and impacts obviously are there. But one impact was the 2008 uprising awake entire Tibetans that we are Tibetans, and then this kind of sense of nationhood, sense of people, it comes to every individual Tibetans who are living in Tibet. And also the 2008 uprising make a really kind of draw international attention that time compared to the past years. And at the same time, the Chinese created kind of propaganda, not only inside Tibet, but even in Chinese media, mainstream media, that the Tibetans, we liberated and developed for past 50, 60 years. But these Tibetans you see today, they are protesting against us and government. These people are kind of ungrateful. This kind of propaganda made even in Chinese masses. And then that cracks the mindset and mentality of Chinese, like we Chinese, they Tibetan. And obviously from Tibetans, they see like across the Tibetan plateau, they crack down everything like ruthlessly. And so the Tibetans suffering under the Chinese rule, and they are oppressor and we are the victim at the moment, and they really have this kind of feelings like as long as the foreign occupation are there, the Tibetans has no real future. And then there's no kind of coexistence between China and Tibet. That's really a milestone in the freedom struggle of our nation. And also there are a number of other impacts and legacies, like Lakka movement. It's a movement started among the Tibetans inside Tibet. It's like a non-cooperation movement. Tibetans, they started to wear Tibetan dress. They started to eat Tibetan foods. Not only eating and wearing, but they started to eat from Tibetan restaurants, only from Tibetan restaurants. And they started to buy everything from only Tibetan shops. And even the elders who are illiterate, in 40s, 50s, 60s, they started learning Tibetan language, reading and writing. From the village, from the grasslands, everywhere. And then the educated Tibetans voluntarily roam around the Tibetan areas and started to teach the Tibetan elders and youngers. And this kind of movement widely going inside Tibet. And even I just give you one statement that widely used today in Tibet. From that itself, you can imagine how the movement getting stronger. Earlier, there's no such kind of things, but since 2008, when two Tibetans, they get into kind of argument between two guys, suppose like, and about to fight, then maybe from bystanders or either of these guys, they say like, if you are brief enough, your animals there. This kind of the words, the phrase they usually used in Tibet since 2008. So this kind of impact and legacy is really, how to say, like, to make more stronger the struggle to be continued.
So to sum up, would you say that the spirit of resistance that was sparked in 2008 will keep on going?
Obviously, as long as the operation is there, then the struggle for freedom will be there. The example is very clear. Between 1949 to 1950, thousands and thousands of Tibetans killed, murdered, and died under the occupation, and then completely. But then after 20-30 years, the second generation who born under the occupation and grow under the Chinese rule started the protest, second protest in 1987 and 88, 89. And it completely crashed down. But then the third generation they started the protest in 2008. And the elders, the younger generation, everyone, the lay people, the monks, the nuns, the university students, college students, nomad farmers, all joined to this protest. So the spirit will be there until Tibet will be free.
Thank you, Wangden.
Thank you.
So I hope this has given you some insight into the significance of the last 10 years and the strength and depth of Tibet's desire to be a nation and a people and to resist foreign occupation. But we promised you poetry today, so I'm now going to invite our visiting poet, Tenzin Tsundue, to come and tell you a little about himself and read some more of our precious Tibetan poems. Just come in a little bit.
Okay, so my name is Tenzin Tsundue. I'm a student of literature. I studied both at the graduate and post-graduation English literature from India. And I started to write poetry in English. I write stories also. I get them published in books like this, and sell them, and I make my living purely out of writing. So while listening to Wangden, I kept on trying to imagine myself as an audience and trying to understand why. Why is there a problem between the Tibetans and the Chinese? And I think this is a very common question anybody would ask, but why do you people have to fight? Why are you always in conflict? So that kind of kept on recurring in me while I was trying to listen. And of course I've listened to Wangden a number of times. And I think there's a very valid question, and anyone could ask this question who is not so familiar with Tibetans. Not just about Tibetan and China, it's generally about any kind of problems. For example, it's between Israel and Palestine, or Kashmir, or Sri Lanka, or problems anywhere in the world. I generally tell stories. I take interest in human stories, and because of that kind of interest, I write poetry and stories. Unlike my friend Wangden, I'm born in India. My parents came from Tibet, so I'm actually the second generation of Tibetans born in India, growing up. Now there is already the third generation growing up and attempting to go to college. So my generation, which is the generation between my parents' generation who lived in Tibet, lived under Chinese occupation and escaped from Tibet, and the generation who is growing up in India who have never seen Tibet and whose parents did not see Tibet. What is commonly among all of us, whether it's my parents' generation, my generation, or those who are growing up in exile, among all of us is the preoccupation of Tibet. There's something that we talk about Tibet almost every day, and Tibet is the central force in our lives. And that is so very funny because all of us, how much ever we talk about Tibet, we cannot go to Tibet. We have nothing to do with Tibet directly. We cannot go, we cannot even touch the borders. And yet we keep on thinking and saying to ourselves that we are going to go to Tibet one day, eventually we are returning. And yet we are in India. There are 150,000 Tibetans living outside Tibet. 150,000, out of which 100,000 live in India. About 15,000 in Nepal, 3,000 to 4,000 in Bhutan, and about 25 to 30,000 spread in different parts of the world, Europe and Americas and Australia. We have about 600 living in the UK. So Tibetans are everywhere, and except for Tibetans living in India and Nepal, others have taken citizenship of those other countries. While in India and in Nepal, both the government of Nepal and India have given us a document called RC, Registration Certificate, RC. So we actually live in India with that paper, which recognizes us as a foreigner living in India. Nepal has, however, stopped issuing that paper from 1996. Now, after 1996, people who are either born or who came from Tibet, they have no paper whatsoever. So they live in a very difficult time. If they are asked by police or any security personnel in Nepal, they will have nothing to show. So they live very, very difficult life in Nepal. Therefore, more Tibetans actually want to move out of Nepal. But because of Nepal's proximity into Tibet, and many Tibetans have already settled in Nepal, people are uncles and aunts and parents, and somehow they have settled in Nepal. India, unlike many other countries, is not signatory to the 1951 and 1967 international treaties on human rights, especially about refugees. India is not signatory, therefore India does not practice refugee law. So therefore, however, emotionally we call ourselves refugees, we are foreigners living in India for a period of 1 year. And at the end of the year, we have to renew our stay. And this is how we live in India. But government of India, unlike other refugees in India, has been more kind to Tibetans with His Holiness the Dalai Lama's grace and everything else. We run almost about 100 schools and almost about 300 to 400 monasteries and 34 refugee camps spread all across India, and that is the space for 100,000 Tibetans living in India. And mainly because it's not just that they love the Dalai Lama extra or the Tibetans more, but because India is under tremendous pressure from China on the Himalayan border, which is 4,000 kilometers of border, and there is so much of military pressure from that. So therefore, India's only real hope for future security is the Tibetans. So therefore, there is reason why they support Tibetan cause in this way. Although politically, government of India earlier used to say Tibet is a part of China, and now from 2003 onwards, government of India says Tibet Autonomous Region is a part of People's Republic of China, meaning that we are not exactly saying what China wants India to say, which is one China policy, one India policy. And India has been more assertive in this language because much of India's internal problems have been solved, unlike how it was earlier when there were problems with Punjab and Kashmir and Northeast. So therefore, India's reciprocity about sovereign nation recognition and therefore one China policies is far more aggressive now in India, especially with this BJP government, which is more nationalistic, has that nationalistic approach. So as I was saying, my parents came from Tibet, and when the Tibetan refugees first came from Tibet, they were given the work of road construction laborers. So my parents worked as road construction laborers, as what we say coolies. They were breaking rocks and laying roads in the upper regions of Himachal, in the Himalayan regions. My mother tells me the story how I was born in a tent on the roadside. So at that time they used to break rocks and set up the tents on the roadside, and after every 10-15 days when the road construction progressed, they used to move the camp kept on shifting. And at that time, I was born in a tent in a very cold June in the Lahore Spiti Valley. So for me, the issues of identity has become the first subject to write about. How do I recognize myself as a Tibetan? And that's the first question, because we see that all across around us are Indians, and how do we recognize ourselves? When we were little in the school, our teachers used to say that we all bore an R on our forehead. R meaning refugees. So we were saying we are refugees. But unlike the meaning of refugees today, especially in Europe and also in the UK, you have so many refugees coming over. So usually the understanding of refugees is someone who is poor and poverty-stricken and dirty and sickly and and who is begging for shelter. When we were growing up, we were very proud refugees. We were proud of bearing that R on our forehead, because the education that came along with that tagging R was that if you are a refugee, there is a hope of reconstructing the independence of Tibet. And that was so very promising. It was a romantic dream for all of us to grow up and become freedom fighters. So I'm writing, one of my first poems is this a poem titled Refugee, where I'm saying, when I was born, my mother said, you are a refugee. Our tent on the roadside smoked in snow. On your forehead, between your eyebrows, my teacher said, there is an R embossed. I scratched and scrubbed on my forehead. I found a branch of red paint. I'm born refugee. I have 3 tongues. The one that sings is my mother tongue. The R on my forehead, between my English and Hindi, the Tibetan tongue reads Tenzin. Freedom means Tenzin. So in one poem, I changed the identity of myself as English language R, refugee, to Tibetan language R, Tenzin. So I'm saying I'm destined to be free. I am free. So such a redefinition of myself and also for the community. I think therefore the work of the writer, the poet, is to articulate what is otherwise painful and very often deeply saddening. And inarticulation, I think, is the biggest pain people bear with. They are just unable to articulate this. Because most people are not gifted with either the imagination or nor the language. And therefore, this is the work of the poet and the writers. So therefore, it is so very important for us to articulate the very, very complicated nature of the problems and the lives that we live. And yes, for me, it's not just the problems, it is the opportunity to be freedom fighters, and therefore the promises that are posed to us in such a complicated, market-oriented world. There are these spirited freedom fighters that Wangden and I belong to. So we never feel let down, we never feel poor or sickly or the ideas of being refugee beggars. We are always so very proud. And I often say this, even though I do not have the luxury of living in freedom in my country, I have the pride that I am involved in a freedom struggle to liberate our country. And that too from a country which is today feared, intimidated, and United States is constantly competing. Yeah? So from such a country, we take the gumption to fight for freedom from that country. So I write about these, the life in between the dream of living, going back to that promised land, and at the same time living in a reality that is so very difficult. The life in between the dream and the reality. One more poem This is a poem written about Tibetan refugees living in India. It's a poem called Exile House. So this was written when the poet and the writer is constantly looking at the society and thinks that we seem to be settling down so much, that we have built guest houses and rooms and restaurants and houses, staff rooms and refugee camps and monasteries and schools. Sometimes the poet feels that we seem to be settling down. Complacency is rooting us down and we may forget to go home, which would be such a tragedy. So out of that concern, I think, and also being an activist, I always think that my duty is that of a watchman, to keep people restless, to keep people reminded of the struggle. So in this poem, I'm using one Tibetan word called changma. Now, changma in Tibetan language is a medium-height tree that can be planted on the fences, and it's flexible, doesn't break in winds, and is vegetative. If you prune the branches, it will quickly grow back. So that is the idea of changma. So I'm using that in the poem. It's a short poem. This poem, Exile House, goes like this. It says, "Our tiled roof dripped, and the four walls threatened to fall apart. But we were to go home soon. So we grew papayas in front of our house, chilies in the garden, and jangmas for our fences. Then pumpkins rolled down the cowshed thatch. Calves trotted out of the manger. Grass on the roof, beans sprouted and climbed down the vines. Money plants crept in through the window. Our house seems to have grown roots. The fences have grown into a jungle. Now, how can I tell my children where we came from?" So it's a constant fear that we may be settling down and we may be forgetting our roots. And I think for all refugees, and I would also include all the immigrants, wherever they're coming from and wherever they're going, there is a fear that they may forget the roots, the original roots, where they came from, and therefore, which includes a language, as my friend was earlier saying. Now, if I tackle this first question that I raised about the origination of this problem between the Tibetans and the Chinese, my last trip to the UK was 2006. At the time, besides London, I also went to Edinburgh University, and at that time there were some Chinese students and some also Brits who were already there with these Chinese students, and they were already targeting to question me on some of the things that I was saying. So their questioning included tactics of neutralization. They wanted to neutralize what I was saying. And so they were saying, oh, human rights violations, America also, it happens in America also, it happens in the UK. So it's the same. Governments anyway inevitably are going to be, problems about jailers and drug addicts and human rights violations. So these kind of tactics. Somehow, wherever I have met Chinese students, and I've been to 20 different countries, and I've met Chinese students in so many places. Very, very rarely I would meet a Chinese, either a student or grown-up, who would agree that there are problems in China and Tibetans were a different country. Most of them would completely deny and to say that we are all, they would say we are all one country, we've always been like this. Because this is a construct the Chinese government has created for the people. And most of them wouldn't even know. And I'm sure there are students on this campus, also Chinese students. Now, if you ask them about the Tiananmen Square massacre, they would either deny completely or play ignorance. So this historical amnesia, either denial or absolute ignorance of history. I think these are tactics where you maintain the construct of a nation that you have created. So this is going on. So problem today is not just about Tibet as a part of China, but an entire narrative of one China. One China. How did this come about? Or what are the components of that one China? And that includes Tibet, East Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria. Till 1911, Manchuria used to rule over China, and China regained its independence in 1911 and 1912. Republic of China, the new modern government of China, was formed under Dr. Sun Yat-sen. So this is the true story of China. But this is being completely negated and ignored. And one China policy that China sells to all the countries who want to trade with China today give the reciprocation that, okay, one China policy, we agree, okay, let us start to trade. So it has just come to a very financial, profiteering kind of agreement and completely negating history. This then is one of the tactics how China has become big, monstrous country that it is today. And it's not just about the territorial land, it is also about the 9 million square kilometers of sea area in the South China Sea, which now United States and UK and European nation, number of countries are contesting. And even after China losing the case in Hague International Court, China anyway maintained that and no one could challenge them. So this is how the monster was created. The reason why China invaded Tibet in 1949-1950 and continues to maintain its occupation today, reasons kept on changing. Earlier, it was the ambition to recreate the grand motherland of China at the time of Mao Zedong. And later, they needed Tibet, East Turkestan, Mongolia for natural resources. Today, they need all these not only for natural resources, but more for the pride to compete with the rest of the world. So reasons kept on changing, but nonetheless, 2.5 million square kilometers of Tibet is so very useful for China because this is almost about 1/4 of China. 2.5. And 1.8 million square kilometers is East Turkestan, a Muslim nation of Uyghur people. 1.2 million square kilometers of Inner Mongolia, and 0.8 million square kilometers of East Turkestan, Manchuria. So all of them actually make 60% of today's China's landmass, which is 9.6 million square kilometers. I was just calculating the UK, which includes all the other countries, of course you would know. This is 245,000 square kilometers of land, the UK. And Tibet, which is 2.5 million square kilometers, Tibet is 10 times the size of the UK. But the population is only 6 million. So if you beat up 2.5, because a 6 million Tibetan population, you get to exploit natural resources from 2.5 million square kilometers, which is the storehouse of waters for Asia, all over Asia. And China themselves have already said that the best quality of lithium, copper, gold, and largest amount of all entire China comes from Tibet. So of course Tibet is so very useful. So they do not want Tibetans, they just want Tibetan land. So therefore they are targeting Tibetan religion, culture, language. Why? Because Tibetan religion, culture, language is the true resource of Tibet that we believe. And for them it's only the natural resources. And these religion, culture, language keep the unity of the Tibetan people. And this is the biggest stumbling block for their constant occupation. And the similar case in East Turkestan. So these are the reasons and how this almost unresolvable Tibet-China issue. My last point. In India, when I travel, when I talk about Tibet, very often my Indian friends keep on saying, Tenzin, you seem to be involved in a very passionate, real, genuine cause. But does Tibet really stand a chance? Look at the size of China, its military, its economic power, its political power is so big that you don't stand a chance, do you? With great sense of sympathy to me. Then I said to them and said, there was a point of time Gandhiji was also asked the same question, where British Empire used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire, and so therefore Gandhiji was asked very sympathetically by some of his supporters, do you stand a chance? Gandhiji wrote his most important writing, his book, Hind Swaraj, in the year 1908, which was kind of a Bible for Indian independence movements. At the time, there was no way India could imagine that India could be free one day. But look at things today. The entire size of the UK is almost like one of the states in India, like Rajasthan and Punjab together would be the size of the UK. So things change. So therefore, unflinching faith in the idea of freedom is how we stand for. And for my journey as an activist and also as a writer, for me, freedom is not just kicking Chinese out of Tibet. In the process of the freedom struggle, how do we maintain our own peace? And I believe that our religion and culture has given us such inner strength, such spiritual strength, that even when we are in the deepest political problem, we have never lost the real sense of peace in ourselves, that our country may not be free, but we are free.
Thank you. So I hope this has given you some insight into the situation in Tibet, into the feelings of Tibetans from Tibet, Tibetan refugees or Wangden warriors born in exile, and also a glimpse of the interplay between poetry and human rights as a vehicle for expression. The poets who've written in here, they are able to use poetic metaphor to express things that they would be arrested for saying if they said them more bluntly. Some of these writers are arrested anyway because China suspects the metaphors. So this is poetry as protest, poetry as resistance. For Tsundue, poetry is a vehicle for his activism, a way to express the exile experience and the Tibetan experience. And I hope you've enjoyed hearing about it this afternoon.
Maybe you can say the title of the book.
This is Burning the Sun's Braids, poetry from Tibetans inside Tibet, translated by Tenzin Tsundue.